Bond basics. Now, what some new candidates don't realize is what a bond actually is. Now, a bond is simply a fancy IOU, and that's all it is. You loan money and you're paid back at a future date. Now, whether a bond is issued by the government, a corporation, or a municipality, bonds share similar features: the par value, the maturity date, and the interest rate. Now, these features are all fixed. Once a bond is issued, we have to take into consideration price and yield, and these features are variable. So simply stated, an investor will loan money to an entity, he'll be paid back at maturity, and he'll receive a stated amount of interest for loaning the money. His bond is evidence of the money that he loaned. Now, questions pertaining to bonds are going to state the maturity date and the interest rate, and unless otherwise noted, we're going to assume a par value of $1,000. So let's begin our discussion of bonds with a simplified example. Now, imagine that you purchase a bond. You purchased a bond for $1,000. It has a maturity of 5 years, and it has an interest rate of 9%. So as you can see in the illustration in the book, the bond has a maturity of 5 years. Year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The bond has an interest rate of 9%. Now, this interest rate could be called a coupon rate of interest or a nominal rate of interest. But a par value of $1,000 times that 9% means that the bond is going to pay $90 in interest per year. So in year 1 through year 5, you're going to receive $90 of interest. Interest is paid semi-annually, so you're going to receive $45 every 6 months. Now, upon maturity, the final payment is going to contain $45 interest as well as the return of your $1,000 investment. Now, in that example, you purchased a bond and you held it to maturity. You loaned $1,000, you were paid back $1,000 at maturity, and you received semi-annual interest payments. Now, let's assume that you couldn't wait until maturity and you wanted your money back in year number 4. So you decide that you're going to sell your bond. Now, there's 2 questions that you're going to want to know the answer to. Number 1, how much interest have I earned since the last time that I was paid interest up to the time that I sold the bond? And number 2, what price will I receive for selling my bond? Now, we're going to discuss bond pricing later in this chapter, and that's going to answer the second question. Now, regarding the first question, the illustration below shows that you sold your bond in year 4 between interest payment dates. Now, in this situation, you're entitled to the interest that's earned from your last payment up to the time that you sold the bond, the day before settlement date, at which point your buyer owns the bond and is therefore entitled to the interest that the bond generates from that point on. Now, interest is earned daily. However, bond issuers only pay semi-annually. Now, this means that the issuer will pay a full 6 months of interest to whoever is the holder of the bond on the interest payment date. Now, if you'll take a look at the illustration in the book, I've blown up year 4 here. Now, as you can see, the last interest payment was received by you. Let's say that you held the bond for another 3 months and you sold the bond. And then 3 months later becomes the next interest payment. Now, it would be very nice if you held the bond for 3 months and you had an amount of interest that was due you, and the issuer cut you a check for that amount of interest until you sold the bond. And then they would start sending interest payments to your buyer who bought the bond and is in line to receive the payments for holding the bond. However, that's not the way it works. They don't count the days that you've held the bond and pay you the interest for the days that you've held the bond. The issuer is simply going to pay interest semi-annually to whomever holds the bond at that point. So that last interest payment that was received by you, you hold the bond for 3 more months. They do not record that. You're going to have to charge the buyer for that interest because that next interest payment is going to include the interest for those 3 months that you've held the bond. So again, I'm going to read from the text of the book, and hopefully it'll clear this up. Now, in this example, again, look at the illustration. If you held the bond for 3 months since your last interest payment, you would be due 3 months of interest. However, upon selling the bond, your buyer becomes the bondholder to which the issuer will pay the full 6 months of interest. So you've got to get that interest back for holding the bond for those 3 months. And the method for capturing that earned interest back would be to charge the buyer in the amount of interest that it's owed to you that's actually going to be paid to the buyer from the issuer in that next interest payment. That's called accrued interest. It's interest that you've earned for holding the bond, yet you haven't received it. It's actually going to be paid to the buyer of the bond because he will be the bondholder the next time that interest is paid. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to figure out how much accrued interest, how much you're owed, and you're simply going to add that amount to the amount that the bond was purchased for, and you're going to charge the buyer of the bond for that amount. It's accrued interest. This will be our next discussion.